Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. You've probably heard about quiet quitting. You may be wondering, what is quiet quitting, and is it anything like this Great Resignation that we've heard so much about over the last couple of years? Well, quiet quitting is not quite the same as the Great Resignation. The Great Resignation refers to people actually quitting their jobs, whereas quiet quitting is something a little bit different, where people stay with the job. They don't actually quit the job itself, but their work output and maybe their attitude at work, maybe their feelings about their work and the organization where they work has changed over time. Let's face it, quiet quitting isn't something that happens in a blink of an eye. It tends to be something that happens over time. So that's what we're talking about here. What are some of the characteristics that you might associate with someone who is in that state of quiet quitting? You may expect something like disengagement, where the employee simply isn't as engaged as they used to be. Maybe the quality of their work or the amount of output of their efforts has diminished. Their attitudes or behaviors may have also changed as a result of quiet quitting. So these are some of the characteristics that are generally associated with this state of quiet quitting, or this idea or experience of quiet quitting. When an individual is experiencing this state of quiet quitting, they may also have a different work experience as a result. So not only will their attitude or motivation or behaviors change, their own experiences will change as well. A day at the office will not be the same as it used to be. When we think about quiet quitting, it's not difficult to figure out that this phenomenon is something that affects both the organization and the individual who is experiencing it. In terms of how quiet quitting may affect the organization, well, we can expect things such as diminished productivity or lowered morale, different behaviors, maybe lack of engagement, such as organizational citizenship or participation in all sorts of different organization-related behaviors or events. When we consider the individual, quiet quitting can have quite a profound effect on them as well. Not only will their productivity or motivation or work experience change, but their health and well-being, and that includes both physical health and mental health or emotional well-being, can all be affected by being in this state or experiencing this state of quiet quitting. So this is something important to consider both for the organization and for the employee. When an employee finds themselves to be disengaged from their work, from their job experience may very quickly become boring and maybe even meaningless. It's not difficult to see how this could be the beginning of a vicious cycle. Those things that may have led to getting into this state of quiet quitting may be exasperated or increased with the passage of time as the employee is experiencing this phenomenon or this state of quiet quitting. When it comes to quiet quitting, the bottom line is that it affects everyone, both the organization and each of the individuals who are experiencing this phenomenon. So let's look at some alternatives to quiet quitting. When it comes to individuals, for some, actual quitting may be the case, but that's rather extreme, and that's not what I would advise for people without further consideration. So let's focus on things other than just plain old quitting the job. The first thing that I would advise for individuals to consider is how they got to the place where they feel like quiet quitting is the way to experience their workplace. How did they get there? What were the things that contributed to the whole experience? Knowing this, understanding this, may provide some clues as to how this state of being, how your current work experience may be changed or fixed so that it is no longer this hopeless, boring experience where you have gotten into this state of quiet quitting. So finding the roots or causes, and there may be many, and this is something that has likely happened over time, not overnight, but understanding how you got there may provide you some clues with how to get out of that place. Another important thing to consider is your work-life balance. Get yourself organized, get yourself as efficient as possible, and that means both at the workplace and at home. And you will likely find that your day runs more smoothly and that your stress is probably reduced as a result. And when you balance your work and your non-work life, you are much more likely to find relief from whatever stress you've been feeling, and maybe even joy in what you do, both at work and outside of the office. So work-life balance can play an important role when we talk about the phenomenon of quiet quitting. When your work-life balance is out of tune, it's not that difficult to be overly stressed and feel anxious all the time. That may contribute to whatever other things add up in a way that cause this phenomenon or this state of quiet quitting. So getting your work-life balance in order is definitely an important consideration. You may want to talk to your boss about where you are in terms of how you feel about your job and your work experience. This is a good time for honest conversations between two professional adults where we leave egos and overly emotional expressions out of it. And while sometimes that's easier said than done, that should be the goal. But the important takeaway here is that a conversation with your employer may be in order here, because while you may be able to change some things on your end to improve your experience at the workplace and maybe even get you out of that state of quiet quitting, there's a good chance that the organization has contributed to the overall experience and should therefore be engaged in making improvements. So make sure you talk to your employer about where you are and how to get out of that unpleasant space of this phenomenon or state of quiet quitting. But quiet quitting, and more specifically getting out of that state, is not only the responsibility of the individual employee. There is plenty that organizations can do to prevent quiet quitting, or if quiet quitting is already a reality for some of the employees within an organization, the organization can do plenty to try and fix and reverse that reality. So what kind of things can an organization do? Well, first and foremost, keep the communications open, and that means in both directions. Just as an organization should be sharing information with their employees, they should also be listening to the employees and really paying attention to the information, the feedback that they're getting from their workforce. Be mindful of the workload. An overloaded employee can keep up for only so long before they burn out or shut down or flat out quit. So be mindful of workloads. In a reality where many people have quit their jobs, it may be very tempting to simply spread the workload among those who remain behind. And while that's sometimes a reality that needs to happen, it cannot happen indefinitely. So an organization has to be very mindful in terms of workload. The other consideration for organizations is compensation and benefits. Are your employees compensated properly for their efforts? It's easy to put that last on your to-do list as an organization or as an employer, but that matters a great deal. It's one of the things that will get people to do as little as possible, do the minimum work required of them, or to even quit. So an organization must pay attention to the compensation and the benefits that it provides for its employees. Just as employees should pay attention to their own work-life balance, so too an organization should encourage proper work-life balance for their employees. That means encouraging people to not work too many hours and to be engaged in their own non-work lives beyond just working all the time. Sometimes organizations can be guilty of promoting everything that is related to the company and not really speaking up on work-life balance or taking care of non-work related things for their individual employees. So that's an important consideration for the organization as well. Recognize your employees for work well done and give credit where credit is due. Oftentimes, employees can feel undervalued or even ignored if they are not recognized for the good work and their efforts. So make sure as an employer that you take the time to recognize your employees for the work that they do. One of the things that can be a big disappointment for employees is their inability to move upwards within an organization. It's so important that an organization is upfront and open about what kind of promotions and movement within the organization will be available for an employee once they join the team. So an organization should pay attention to that and be very honest about it. However, remember too that just because an employee may not be able to be promoted in an upward direction endlessly, they may be able to gain knowledge and responsibility in a more lateral direction. So that may be an attractive offer for many employees, but it's up to the organization to be very upfront with their employees so that everybody knows what to expect. If an employee is expecting to move upward and be promoted on a regular basis, but that's not part of the reality of the organization and its current structure, then the employee will be disappointed without ever having been told the reality of their employment with that organization. So it's so important to communicate on this topic as well. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. While we've all heard about the Great Resignation, where many people have quit their jobs, the quiet quitting phenomenon is the latest topic of conversation. This is something where employees don't actually quit their job, but are much more disengaged and do the absolute minimum, the bare minimum of what they need to do for their job. This is something that is hurtful both to the individual employee and to the organization as a whole. as with so many different things that are discussed in this podcast, when it comes to responsibility for improving the situation, once again, it falls on everybody. Individuals have the responsibility, as do the organizations. So what can individuals do? Well, recognizing what has led up to this state of quiet quitting is tremendous for helping you to identify how you can improve things and reverse this phenomenon. Understanding your contribution, the employer's contribution, is critical. Having a conversation with your employer will be very helpful if it's done in a professional, non-emotional, non-ego-driven way. And of course, taking care of your work-life balance is always a helpful suggestion for any issue that you may encounter. Organizations have just as much responsibility when it comes to quiet quitting and their employees. There are things that organizations can do to prevent quiet quitting, or once the phenomenon has actually taken hold, there are things that organizations can do to reduce it. As an organization, make sure that you keep the communications open. That's always key. Understand what is happening with your employees, what messages and information are they sending your way, and what do you need to do to improve their work experience, from workload to pay and benefits. All of that can be a contributor to the state or the phenomenon of quiet quitting. So as an organization, it's your responsibility to make sure you know what's going on and then get on the right track to prevent or improve the situation if you're already having some of your employees experience quiet quitting. As the week unfolds, I encourage you to examine your own situation. As an individual employee, examine where you are in terms of quiet quitting. Is this something that you may already be experiencing, or perhaps something where you are on your way to experiencing that phenomenon or to getting into that state? If so, consider what you've learned in this episode and make sure that you are proactive in either preventing getting into that state of quiet quitting or reversing the things that are happening now that may lead you in that direction. And as an employer, you absolutely have to know what's going on with your employees. If you choose to not pay attention to the messages that your employees are sending to you, or if you don't know that your employees are sending plenty of information your way, then you may be surprised in the end. Quiet quitting is something that is affecting everybody, both the organization and the individual employees. So it's important to examine this phenomenon and figure out what can be done to make things better. After all, if it's hurting the organization as a whole and if it's hurting individual employees, it's not something to keep around, and it's something that should be examined and hopefully reversed or fixed in one way or another. So I encourage you to take a look at your own situation at your level in terms of whether you are experiencing quiet quitting, or if you're heading in that direction, or if your employees are sending you clear messages that they may be feeling that quiet quitting type of experience in their own workplace experiences. For those of you who are experiencing this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel. The link is below. You will find this podcast there in a video version. In addition to the podcast, you can find other videos there that focus on a comprehensive approach to stress management. So I hope that you visit my YouTube channel. You can find the link below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.